The air was thin, and the crimson sands of the alien planet shimmered under the twin suns. Derek Cole wiped the sweat off his brow, his rugged face etched with both determination and exhaustion. This was his third day in the excavation site, and despite his years of experience, nothing had prepared him for what he had just unearthed. In front of him lay a strange, otherworldly sword. Its blade seemed to glow faintly, pulsating with an energy that defied logic. Intricate alien markings ran along the hilt, and the metal was unlike anything he had seen before, shimmering as if it were alive. Derek's curiosity burned brighter than his caution. He gently picked up the sword, feeling a faint hum travel through his fingers. "This isn't normal," he muttered to himself, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. As an archaeologist, he had always believed in uncovering the mysteries of the universe. But this discovery felt different. The sword seemed to call out to him, almost as if it were alive, waiting for something or someone. Suddenly, a loud, piercing sound shattered the silence. A beam of light shot into the sky from the sword's blade, splitting the atmosphere with a roar. Derek stumbled backward, dropping the sword onto the sand. The beam stretched high, piercing the clouds and disappearing into the void of space. "What the hell just happened?" Derek exclaimed, his heart pounding. Before he could gather his thoughts, a shadow loomed over him. He turned to see a massive alien craft descending from the sky, its sleek, black surface gleaming like polished obsidian. Derek froze, his instincts screaming at him to run, but his feet were rooted to the ground. The ship landed with a deafening thud, sending tremors through the ground. The craft's doors slid open with a hiss, revealing towering alien warriors clad in dark armor. Their eyes glowed a menacing blue, and their movements were calculated and precise. One of them stepped forward, pointing a sharp spear-like weapon at Derek. "Human," the alien growled in a deep, guttural tone. "You have touched what is forbidden." Derek raised his hands instinctively, his mind racing. "I didn't mean to. I was just..." Silence. The alien barked, its glowing eyes narrowing. "You have awakened the blade of Queen Veloria. For this, you will answer before her." Before Derek could protest, he was surrounded, his wrists bound by glowing cuffs. He was dragged into the ship, the sword taken along with him. As the craft ascended into the sky, Derek stared out the window, watching the excavation site grow smaller and smaller. His mind was filled with questions. Who was this Queen Veloria? What was so special about the sword? And why did he feel as though his life had just taken a turn he could never undo? Little did Derek know, his actions had set events in motion that would change the fate of not just his life, but the entire galaxy. The hum of the alien ship's engines was a constant, low vibration beneath Derek's feet. He sat in a corner of the metallic chamber, his wrists still bound by the glowing cuffs. The room was cold and sterile, the walls smooth and gleaming with an eerie silver light. The aliens who had captured him stood like statues, their glowing eyes watching him closely. Derek couldn't decide if they were studying him or simply waiting for the right moment to strike. His heart raced, but he forced himself to think. Panic wouldn't help now. The sword, her sword, had been taken from him and placed in a sealed case at the far end of the room. Even from this distance, he could feel the faint energy radiating from it. It was unlike anything he had encountered in his years of exploring ancient ruins. "What is this queen going to do to me?" Derek muttered under his breath, his voice a whisper. He glanced at the nearest guard, but the alien didn't react. It stood motionless, its expression unreadable. The silence was broken by a sharp chime, followed by the smooth hiss of a door opening. A smaller alien, clad in ornate robes, stepped into the room. Its appearance was different from the others, its movements more deliberate, its gaze sharp and calculating. It approached Derek, looking down at him with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. "You are the human who dared to awaken the blade of Veloria," the alien said, its voice softer than the guard's, yet no less intimidating. "Do you understand what you've done?" Derek shrugged. trying to mask his fear with bravado. "I found a sword. I didn't know it was such a big deal." The robed alien's eyes narrowed. "You have committed an offense against the queen herself. That blade is no ordinary weapon. It is a sacred artifact, bound to her very existence. By touching it, you have violated ancient laws." Derek frowned, trying to piece together the significance of what he had stumbled into. If it's so important, why was it buried in a ruin? The alien didn't answer. Instead, it motioned to the guards, who hauled Derek to his feet. "You will face Queen Valoria and explain your actions. Perhaps she will grant you mercy, or perhaps she will destroy you for your insolence." The guards led Derek through a series of twisting corridors, the ship's design both beautiful and unsettling. The walls pulsed faintly with light, as though the vessel itself was alive. Eventually, they reached a massive door, intricately engraved with alien symbols. It slid open with a deep rumble, revealing a grand throne room. At the center of the room sat Queen Valoria. Her presence was overwhelming. Tall, regal, and surrounded by an aura of raw power. Her piercing gaze locked onto Derek the moment he entered. "So," she said, her voice cold and commanding, "this is the human who dared to touch what is mine." Derek's breath caught in his throat. He had no idea how he was going to survive this encounter. Derek's legs felt like they might give out beneath him as he was pushed into the center of the grand throne room. The air in the chamber was heavy, almost electric, and he could feel every eye in the room on him. Alien guards lined the walls, their expressions unreadable but their weapons ready. At the far end, sitting atop a throne made of shimmering obsidian, was Queen Valoria. She was unlike any being Derek had ever encountered. Her presence was both mesmerizing and terrifying. Her tall, slender frame was adorned with intricate armor that seemed to glow faintly, and her piercing violet eyes seemed to look straight into his soul. A dark crown rested on her head, its spiked edges glowing with the same eerie light as the sword he had discovered. Valoria leaned forward, her gaze unrelenting. "Human," she began, her voice smooth, yet filled with menace. "Do you know what you have done?" Derek hesitated, the weight of her authority pressing down on him. I didn't mean to offend, Your Majesty. I found the sword in an old ruin. I thought it was just an artifact." "Just an artifact." Valoria's voice rose, her anger flashing like a storm. "That blade is no mere trinket. It is the blade of sovereignty, bound to me through blood and legacy. It was stolen long ago, and its absence has weakened my power." Derek swallowed hard, realizing the gravity of his situation. "I didn't know. I swear. I didn't mean to disrespect you." Valoria rose from her throne, her towering figure casting a long shadow across the room. Her voice grew colder. "Ignorance does not absolve you, human. The blade's activation sent a signal across the galaxy. Do you have any idea what chaos you've unleashed? My enemies will come for it. And for me." Derek clenched his fists, frustration bubbling beneath his fear. "Then it's a good thing I found it, and not one of them." The room fell silent. The Queen's eyes narrowed as she regarded him, as though she were trying to decide if he was brave or simply foolish. "You speak boldly for someone in chains." "I speak the truth," Derek shot back, his voice steady now. "If you destroy me, you lose the one person who knows where I found the sword and how it was hidden. Maybe I can help you." Gasps echoed around the room, and the guards shifted uncomfortably. Derek wasn't sure if he had just saved himself or signed his death warrant. Valoria descended the steps of her throne, stopping mere inches from him. Her presence was overwhelming, her violet eyes locking onto his. "You think you, a mere human, can offer help to me. You are bold, if nothing else." Derek stood his ground, meeting her gaze despite the fear gnawing at him. "Sometimes boldness is all we have." For a moment, Valoria said nothing, the tension in the room palpable. Finally, she smiled faintly, a smile that promised both intrigue and danger. "Very well, human. I will give you a chance to prove your worth. But if you fail, your life is mine." Derek's heart pounded as he realized his gamble had worked, for now. But what lay ahead would test him in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The days that followed were a blur of preparation. Derek had been kept under guard, but allowed a bit more freedom than before. His wrists were no longer bound, but the ever-watchful eyes of Valoria's soldiers were never far from him. He was taken to different parts of the massive ship, where he could observe the Queen's strategy and her intricate plans to restore her lost power. But despite the danger, Derek's mind was always on one thing: the trial. Valoria had promised him a chance to prove his worth. But what did that mean? What kind of trial would a queen like her choose? Finally, after days of uncertainty, Derek was summoned to the throne room once again. The doors slid open, and the guards ushered him inside. Queen Valoria was seated on her obsidian throne, her gaze sharp and calculating as always. She motioned for Derek to approach. "You will face the trial of the void," she declared, her voice firm. "A test of your courage, wit, and resilience. It is the only way to prove you deserve your life and my trust." Derek's heart skipped a beat. The trial of the void. He had heard rumors of such tests: dangerous, unpredictable, and often deadly. The void was a place where few survived, a maze of shifting dimensions and creatures from nightmares. "I don't have a choice, do I?" Derek asked, his voice betraying the slightest tremor. "No," Valoria replied coldly. "You don't. Fail, and you will never leave here alive." With that, she stood and waved her hand. A shimmering portal appeared before them, its swirling colors beckoning Derek toward it. He swallowed hard, steeling himself for what was to come. "You'll have 3 days," Valoria's voice rang out behind him as he stepped forward. "Survive, and you will have your chance to earn my favor. Fail, and you will be forgotten." Without another word, Derek stepped through the portal. The world around him shifted violently. One moment, he was in the throne room, and the next, he was in the midst of a dark, vast landscape. The sky was filled with swirling black clouds, and the ground beneath him felt as though it was alive, shifting and pulsing with strange energy. He could feel a chill in the air, a sense that something was watching him from the shadows. Derek took a deep breath, focusing on the task ahead. He had no idea what the trial would bring, but he couldn't afford to back down now. He wasn't just fighting for his life. He was fighting for a chance to prove that humans weren't as weak as others believed. He took a step forward, his eyes scanning the landscape. The ground seemed to open before him, revealing a dark pit. From within the pit, a low growl echoed, sending a shiver down his spine. A massive creature, a mix of reptilian and insectoid features, emerged from the darkness. Its eyes glowed a fierce yellow, and its claws were sharp enough to rip through metal. Derek didn't hesitate. He grabbed a sharp rock from the ground, using it as a weapon. The creature lunged at him, but Derek ducked just in time, narrowly avoiding its deadly claws. He wasn't a soldier, but he had survived enough dangerous situations to know how to think fast. As he darted away, he realized that the trial wasn't just about surviving the creatures. It was about using his mind to outwit the danger that surrounded him. Derek knew that the only way out was to rely on the same ingenuity that had gotten him this far. The trial had begun, and Derek knew he had to be ready for whatever else the void had in store for him. Derek's heart pounded in his chest as he ducked behind a jagged rock, narrowly escaping another swipe from the monstrous creature in the trial of the void. The alien beast had relentless speed, but Derek was faster, relying on his quick thinking to outmaneuver it. The growl of the creature echoed through the dark, twisted landscape, its yellow eyes glowing like twin suns in the pitch-black sky. "Think, think," Derek muttered to himself, scanning the environment for any advantage. The creature was too fast and powerful to fight head-on, but he had to find a way to survive. As he crouched, his mind raced. The creature wasn't just strong, it was predictable. He knew it would strike at the same spot if given the chance. Derek grabbed a loose boulder and hurled it to his left, making the creature charge at the sound. As it lunged, Derek darted in the opposite direction, barely avoiding its deadly claws. The beast slammed into the rock face, momentarily stunned. Derek didn't waste any time. He sprinted toward the edge of the arena-like space and spotted a large, glowing crystal embedded in the ground. It seemed to pulse with a strange energy. Without hesitation, Derek raced to the crystal, grabbing it with both hands. The moment his fingers made contact, the crystal's energy surged through him, filling him with an intense warmth. The creature, recovering from its earlier crash, turned toward him again. But this time, Derek felt something new, a sharp focus, a surge of power in his body. He didn't know what the crystal did, but it gave him strength, just enough to face the beast head-on. He ran toward it, gripping a sharp rock in his hand. As the creature lunged, Derek threw the rock with precision, striking it directly in the eye. It roared in pain and staggered back, giving Derek a moment to act. With his heart racing, he reached for a jagged stone nearby, and with all his strength, drove it into the creature's side. It let out a final, horrible scream before collapsing to the ground, motionless. Derek stood there, panting, sweat trickling down his forehead. The creature's body lay still, but he knew this was far from over. He had only completed one challenge in this deadly trial. He didn't even know what else awaited him. But he couldn't stop now. The landscape around him began to shift again, the dark sky swirling as though the void itself was alive. A voice echoed through the air, deep and powerful, filling the space with its weight. "Congratulations, human," it said, unmistakably Valoria's voice. "You have survived the first test, but there is more. Your next challenge lies ahead." Derek blinked, a sense of dread rising within him. He had thought the trial was over, but Valoria's voice made it clear. The hardest part was yet to come. The ground beneath his feet trembled. From the shadows, more monstrous figures began to emerge, their eyes glowing with malice. It was clear, this was just the beginning. Suddenly, the portal to the outside world flickered to life. It was a brief window, but it was enough to give Derek a glimpse of the Queen's ship in the distance, the only real sign of safety. He had to make it there. But what kind of dangers awaited him on the other side? "Survive, and you will have my favor," Valoria's voice boomed. "Fail, and you will remain here, lost in the void, forgotten." Derek didn't hesitate. He took a deep breath, steeled himself, and sprinted toward the portal. Time was running out, and so was his chance to prove himself. The air around Derek was thick with tension as the portal closed behind him, leaving the void's darkness behind. He emerged into a new alien world, the landscape stretching before him in jagged cliffs and vast valleys. The sky was a deep, burnt orange, and strange, towering trees with glowing veins spread across the land. It was beautiful, yet unnerving. Nothing like Earth, and certainly nothing he had ever seen. Derek had barely caught his breath before a familiar, cold voice reached his ears. "Human." He turned to see Queen Valoria standing before him, her towering figure adorned in shimmering armor. Her eyes locked on him with an intensity that was both unnerving and curious. "The next part of your trial begins now." He frowned, taking in his surroundings. "Where are we?" Valoria's eyes narrowed slightly. "We are on the planet of Eloris. This is where the Temple of Unity lies. Your task is to reach the temple and return the Blade of Sovereignty to its rightful place. But know this, the temple is guarded, and not by mere creatures. You will face your greatest challenges yet." Derek swallowed, the weight of her words pressing on him. The blade, the one he had found, had to be returned. But the journey ahead would be perilous. He had already faced one trial, but this was different. He was not alone now, and Valoria's presence added an unexpected layer of complexity to his mission. Valoria motioned for Derek to follow as she led the way through the thick forest, her movements graceful and calculated. Her soldiers flanked them on either side, silent and watchful, their armor gleaming under the strange light of the planet. Derek kept his pace steady, but his mind raced. This temple was important. He could feel it in his gut. There was power here, something ancient, something dangerous. What kind of dangers are we talking about? Derek asked, keeping his voice even. Valoria glanced at him, her expression unreadable. You'll see soon enough. They walked in silence for a while, the only sounds being the hum of the wind through the alien trees and the distant calls of unknown creatures. Derek found himself growing uneasy, sensing something was off. The forest around them felt alive, watching them. It wasn't long before his suspicions were confirmed. Out of nowhere, a loud screech echoed through the air, followed by a blur of motion. Derek barely had time to react as a massive creature, resembling a mix between a wolf and a serpent, lunged from the underbrush. Its fangs gleamed, and its claws swiped through the air with deadly precision. Before Derek could reach for any weapon, Valoria stepped forward, her blade flashing with speed and power. In one smooth motion, she struck down the creature, her sword cutting through its hide like it was paper. The creature crumpled to the ground, lifeless. Derek stood frozen, his heart hammering in his chest. What was that? Valoria sheathed her sword and turned toward him. That was just the beginning. The temple is protected by creatures much more dangerous than this one. You must remain alert. Focus, human, or you will not make it. As Derek and Queen Valoria moved deeper into the jungle, the atmosphere grew thicker with tension. The air was heavy with the scent of strange flowers, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to shift with each step. The path to the Temple of Unity was not an easy one. Twisted vines hung low, and the jungle was alive with the sounds of unseen creatures. Derek couldn't help but feel the weight of the sword in his hand. The blade of sovereignty had been in his possession for days now, but the more he held it, the more he felt that there was something about it he didn't understand. The power that pulsed from the blade was unlike anything he had ever experienced. It was as if the sword itself was alive, connected to something far older and more dangerous than he could comprehend. He glanced over at Valoria, who walked with an air of unshakable confidence, her eyes scanning the surroundings as she led them forward. Her silence spoke volumes. She was clearly more attuned to the dangers of this world than he was, but even she seemed to respect the quiet menace of the jungle. "Why is the sword so important to you?" Derek asked, breaking the silence between them. Valoria didn't look at him immediately. Instead, her sharp gaze remained focused on the path ahead, as if weighing his question. Finally, she answered, her voice softer than Derek had expected. "It is not just a weapon," she said. "The blade of sovereignty is a symbol of my rule, bound to me through blood and sacrifice. It holds the power to control the forces of the universe, forces that are not meant to fall into the wrong hands. For centuries, it has been passed down through my family. It is not just a sword, it is a key." "A key," Derek echoed, confused. "A key to what?" Valoria finally turned her head to look at him. Her violet eyes were intense, and there was something ancient in her gaze. "A key to the Temple of Unity. The temple is more than just a place of worship. It is a nexus, a gathering point for the power that flows through the galaxy. The blade can unlock the temple's core, where the true power lies." Derek felt a chill run down his spine. The temple wasn't just a relic. It was a source of unimaginable power. He had always known that his discovery of the sword was important, but he hadn't understood the full scope of what he had stumbled upon. "So, what happens if the wrong person gets their hands on this power?" he asked. Valoria's expression darkened. The universe could fall into chaos. The balance that has kept the galaxy from destroying itself for centuries could unravel. The blade of sovereignty is meant to be wielded by those who understand its true nature, not by those who seek to control it for selfish reasons. Derek nodded slowly, the gravity of her words settling in. He had already seen glimpses of the chaos the sword could cause. The rival factions, the creatures of the void, the dark forces that lurked in the shadows. They were all drawn to the sword's power. But now, Derek couldn't help but wonder if he was the one who was meant to wield it. Could a human really understand the power of something so ancient and vast? He didn't know, but he felt something stirring inside him. A connection to the sword that he couldn't explain. It was as if the blade was calling to him, urging him forward. Valoria's voice broke through his thoughts. "The temple is near. We must hurry." As they continued through the jungle, Derek couldn't shake the feeling that the true test was not in reaching the temple, but in understanding the power he now held. The blade of sovereignty was more than just a weapon. It was a choice, and Derek would soon have to decide if he was ready for the responsibility it demanded. Ahead, through the trees, the dark silhouette of the Temple of Unity loomed. The journey had only just begun. The Temple of Unity loomed before them, its towering stone structure hidden deep within the dense jungle. Ancient rooms covered the walls, and the massive entrance stood open, inviting them inside. Derek couldn't help but feel a mixture of awe and fear as he gazed at the temple. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. The energy surrounding it was palpable, a force that seemed to hum in the air. He could almost feel the power of the blade of sovereignty vibrating in his hand, as if it recognized its true home. Queen Valoria stood at his side, her gaze unwavering as she surveyed the temple's entrance. Her face was unreadable, but Derek could sense the tension in her posture. This was a place of great importance for her, and he wasn't sure what awaited them inside. "I don't like this," Derek said quietly, glancing at Valoria. "Something feels wrong." Valoria's eyes narrowed as she stepped forward, her hand resting on the hilt of her sword. "Stay alert," she replied, her voice low and tense. "The temple is not what it seems. There are dangers here that you cannot even imagine." The two of them, along with Valoria's guards, entered the temple. The interior was vast and dimly lit, the stone walls covered in ancient symbols and faded murals depicting scenes of battles and power. The air inside was thick with dust, and the distant echoes of their footsteps seemed to reverberate through the emptiness. As they moved deeper into the temple, Derek couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, but Valoria pressed on, her face set with determination. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet shifted, and a loud rumble echoed through the temple. Before they could react, a group of armed figures appeared from the shadows, their faces hidden behind dark hoods. Derek's heart sank. They were surrounded. Valoria's hand instinctively reached for her sword, but the figures didn't attack. Instead, one of them stepped forward, pulling back its hood to reveal a familiar face, one Derek had not expected to see. "It's been a long time, Valoria," the man said, his voice cold and mocking. Valoria froze, her eyes narrowing in disbelief. "You," she whispered. "You were supposed to be dead." The man smiled cruelly. "You were wrong. I've been waiting for this day. The day I would reclaim the blade of sovereignty for myself." Derek looked between the two, confusion flooding his mind. "Who is he?" he asked, his voice edged with suspicion. "This is Arcton," Valoria said through gritted teeth. "My brother." "The traitor." Derek's eyes widened. A traitor? Valoria had a brother. He had no idea what this meant for their mission, but he could sense the tension between them. This was more than a battle for the sword. This was personal. Arcton's laugh echoed through the temple. "Your precious blade won't save you now, Valoria. The temple is mine, and with the blade of sovereignty, I will control the galaxy." Derek felt the weight of the sword in his hands again. He had thought the trials were the hardest part of this journey, but now he realized the true test was not just surviving. It was facing the betrayal of someone close to Valoria, someone who would stop at nothing to claim the power for himself. Valoria's face twisted with rage. "You'll never have it, Arcton." With a flash of movement, Valoria charged, her sword gleaming in the dim light. The battle for the blade of sovereignty was about to begin. The battle erupted in a blur of motion, Valoria's sword gleamed with deadly precision as she rushed toward her brother, Arcton. Derek's heart raced, unsure of where to turn as the two warriors clashed in a storm of sparks and fury. The air was thick with tension, and Derek could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him. This wasn't just about the sword anymore. It was about family, betrayal, and a fight for the future of the galaxy. Arcton parried Valoria's first strike with a cruel smile, his dark eyes glinting with malice. "You were always the favored one, Valoria. Always the chosen one," he sneered. "But now, I will show you what true power is." Valoria's eyes flashed with rage as she spun around, aiming another strike at her brother. But Arcton was quick, ducking and moving with an unnatural grace, his own weapon, a jagged black blade, coming down in a swift arc. Their swords clashed, the sound of metal on metal ringing out like thunder. Derek stood frozen for a moment, watching the chaos unfold. He wanted to help, to do something, but the guards surrounding them were too numerous, and he had no weapon to defend himself. He glanced down at the blade of sovereignty in his hands, the weapon that had caused all of this. He knew it was important, but right now, it felt like more of a curse than a blessing. "Derek." Valoria's voice broke through his thoughts, sharp and commanding. She had momentarily gained the upper hand, pushing Arcton back with a series of quick, precise strikes. "Get the sword to the altar. You must place it in the temple's core." Derek's eyes widened. The altar. The heart of the temple. It was their only chance to stop Arcton and prevent him from taking control of the sword's power. He didn't know how long Valoria could hold her brother off, but he knew that every second counted. He gripped the blade of sovereignty tightly and ran toward the altar, his feet pounding against the stone floor. The temple seemed to pulse with energy, the power of the sword filling the air. As he approached the altar, Derek could feel the weight of the moment. This was it. This was the moment that would decide everything. Behind him, the sounds of the battle grew louder. Arcton's laughter echoed through the chamber, dark and triumphant. "You think you can stop me? The sword belongs to me," he shouted, his voice full of venom. Derek didn't look back. He reached the altar and raised the blade of sovereignty above his head, feeling its power surge through him. The ancient runes etched into the altar began to glow, and the ground beneath Derek's feet trembled. It was as if the temple itself was alive, reacting to the sword's presence. But then, as Derek prepared to place the blade into the heart of the altar, he heard a voice. Valoria's voice, filled with desperation. "No, don't." He froze. What was she trying to warn him about? Arcton's voice cut through the tension. "It's too late, Valoria. The power is mine now." Derek felt the sword hum with an overwhelming force, and for a moment he was paralyzed by its power. The blade of sovereignty seemed to call to him, urging him to act. But as he looked back at Valoria and Arcton locked in combat, Derek realized something. He wasn't just holding the sword for himself. He was holding it for everyone. The weight of the decision crushed down on him, and with a single decisive motion, he placed the sword into the altar's core. The temple shook violently, a blinding light flooding the room as the sword's power was released. Derek could only watch as the battle raged on, knowing that the fate of the galaxy now rested on the choices they made. The moment the blade of sovereignty was placed in the altar's core, a pulse of pure energy erupted through the temple. The entire structure seemed to come alive, vibrating with an intensity that made Derek's bones ache. The ground beneath his feet trembled, and a powerful gust of wind swirled around him, making his clothes whip against his skin. The altar glowed with a blinding light, and Derek instinctively shielded his eyes. He could hear Valoria and Arcton's battle behind him, but the noise felt distant, muffled by the overwhelming surge of power. The blade hummed in the heart of the altar, its energy filling the room, resonating with an ancient force that had been dormant for centuries. When the light began to fade, Derek slowly opened his eyes. The temple had transformed. The air was thick with energy, and the rooms that lined the walls pulsed with a steady rhythm, as if the entire temple was now connected to the sword's power. Vyloria and Arcton were still locked in combat, but their movements had slowed. The power of the sword had changed the very air around them, and now it was clear. This was no longer just a battle of strength. It was a battle for control of the ancient force that had been unleashed. Vyloria's sword clashed with Arcton's again, but this time there was something different in her movements. She was more focused, more determined. The power of the sword had awakened something inside her, something deep and primal. She was no longer just fighting for her throne. She was fighting for her people, for the future of the galaxy. Arcton, Vyloria shouted, her voice full of fury. This ends now. Arcton grinned, his eyes wild with madness. You think you can control it? The power is mine, Vyloria. I've waited too long for this. Derek's heart raced. He couldn't just stand there. He had to do something. He wasn't a warrior like Vyloria, but he had a different kind of strength. His mind, his ingenuity, it was his greatest asset. With a deep breath, Derek turned to the altar, the blade still glowing with an unearthly light. He reached out, his fingers brushing the surface of the altar, and in that moment, he felt a connection. The sword, the temple, it was all part of something greater, something ancient. He understood now that this wasn't just about defeating Arcton. It was about using the power for good, not for personal gain. Derek stepped forward, placing his hands on the altar's edge. The energy surged through him, filling his body with strength and clarity. He focused all his thoughts on Vyloria, on the mission they had started together. The sword was more than a weapon. It was a symbol of unity, of balance. With one final push, Derek reached for the blade again, feeling its power surge through him. Vyloria, he shouted, his voice filled with conviction. We can end this now, together. Vyloria hesitated for a moment, glancing at Derek. Then, with a fierce cry, she lunged forward, her sword meeting Arcton's in a final clash. But this time, there was no struggle. Arcton faltered, his strength weakening under the power of the sword and the temple's energy. Vyloria's sword sliced through the air, and in one swift motion, she disarmed her brother. Arcton stumbled back, his face twisted in disbelief. No, he whispered, his voice barely audible. This isn't possible. Vyloria stood tall, her eyes filled with a mixture of triumph and sorrow. It's over, Arcton. The power is not yours to control. With that, she stepped forward and took the blade of sovereignty from the altar, holding it high. The temple seemed to sigh in relief, its energy settling into a calm rhythm once more. Derek watched, his heart still pounding in his chest. Vyloria had won, but there was more to be done. The sword was no longer just a weapon. It was a key to a new beginning. Vyloria turned to him, her eyes softened with gratitude. You were right, Derek. It's not just about strength. It's about understanding. We have much work to do together. Derek nodded, feeling the weight of the moment. This wasn't just the end of one fight. It was the beginning of a new alliance, one that could reshape the galaxy for the better. Together, they would ensure that the power of the Blade of Sovereignty was used wisely. The future was uncertain, but with the bond they had forged, Derek knew they could face whatever came next.